Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, I thought I'd share with those listeners something that's rather fun and intriguing. I think everybody has a transcendent issue when it comes to things such as appraising art, antiques, and collectibles. There's certainly always a lot of interest. I know myself, when I'm flipping the channels on a lazy weekend, I always find myself from time to time clicking in on PBS as they do Antiques Roadshow. And from time to time in my city of Portland, Oregon, we have the Antique and Collectibles Show, of which I find myself perusing through the aisles and aisles of things that people bring to be assessed, to be valued, and to be sold. The question is, though, when you find yourself interested as you walk into the local thrift store or Goodwill, you ask yourself, what really does have value here, especially if you catch one of those shows where somebody shows mugs, basic coffee mugs that don't seem to have much value that somebody happened to buy for a few bucks that now appraised for $1,000 to $5,000. How do we find out what these kinds of things are actually worth? And is that our motivation once we decide to lock in on something that interests us? Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is someone who's going to bring that kind of eyesight as well as experience with more than 30 years in the appraisal market. She has also worked for many estates for celebrities and CEOs and knows the value, and nothing, no matter how quirky or unusual, is beyond analysis. In the last 9 years, she has responded to inquiries through her radio show and her weekly newspaper column, Ask the Gold Digger, answering questions and giving practical advice on how to value, divest a wide range of personal belongings. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest and author of the book Collect, Value, Divest, The Savvy Appraiser, Dr. Elizabeth Stewart. Dr. Stewart,
Hello
thank you for joining us.
Hello there. Hi, Daniel.
You know, at first when I got this book, I'm thinking, from time to time, we get a lot of books in our program, and I'm doing a lot of reading, and sometimes you just think, boy, I go to bed at night thinking I'm sort of one of those people that should be on Jeopardy. I'm just full of a lot of information. But
yes.
This one, I really have enjoyed the heck out of reading it. I mean, very storytelling, very insightful, and I think it triggers for anybody that picks this up that innate curiosity we have. I mean, this is something that transcends everybody's interest, when you think of stories, not just what things are worth, but just learning more about it. And that's certainly the core of what you talk about here today.
Well, I have a question for you, Daniel. Do you have an object in your home or in your collections or maybe, your family's collections that you're curious about?
Well, actually, I was thinking about that actually today, as my parents are getting older. One of the things my mother was involved in many, many years ago, she was involved with Princess House Crystal. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And I had always just expressed an interest in this. In fact, at one time I was like, Mom, I kind of wouldn't mind getting involved with this just because I really like the way the stuff looks, just the different patterns and things like that. And in fact, in my freezer, something my wife uses, I have 4 crystal mugs that are real solid. They're Princess House crystal mugs that she just gave to me. I was going to buy them, but she never asked for the money. But I know she's got a lot of that stuff, I believe, still in boxes. But I had expressed years and years ago that I was just interested in this stuff. Not that, I was saying, I'd like to have that. But, that was one of those things that I have always been interested in.
So do you know if it's cut or pressed?
See, I wouldn't know anything like that. I just know she was slightly involved with Princess House, and she has a lot of this stuff. And like I said, some of it's still in boxes. So.
Okay, so let me tell you, if there's folks that are listening out there and they do have crystal, the question is, perhaps, how do I know if it's crystal? And the first thing is the old wives' tale. If you ping it with your fingernail and it rings, you'll hear the lead content. So crystal has lead in it, whereas normal glass that's actually the glass that we get a glass of water at a restaurant, for example, does not have lead in it. So crystal has lead in it. How you tell if it's cut or pressed? Well, there's glass that's pressed into a mold, and that mold makes the marks. In other words, if it's sort of a knockoff of a Waterford piece, it'll make the marks, the up and down marks, they won't be sharp. So cut crystal is sharp, and it has almost a knife edge sharpness because it is cut on a big steel wheel by hand. And so cut crystal is cut And pressed crystal is pressed into an injection mold, almost poured into a mold. Sometimes those molds are 2 or 3 pieces. When they break apart, you can see the mold marks in the glass. And why that makes a difference is because cut crystal with lead is more valuable than pressed crystal.
Yeah, that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, so you would say, well, do I have a piece that's cut or if it's pressed? Mm-hmm. And pressed glass was very popular for about 100 years. Started right after the Civil War, and it was an American invention to actually make glass and pour molten glass into a metal mold. So that's been around a long time. So you've got Princess House, and that Princess House, it's interesting because they were one of these places that had everything for entertaining, for a nice table. And I find it so interesting because my son, who is just recently married, he's 30, he does not want any of that fine entertaining stuff, doesn't want the good crystal, doesn't want the good china, doesn't want the china for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and doesn't want any of that. He actually wants it if he can put it in the dishwasher or the microwave, period.
Yeah, I'm a practical guy when it comes to cookware as well, having been in the restaurant industry. I know how to go out and say, I'm going to buy this dish to use because I have a variety of uses I can use it for, which means a reduction in what you have in the cupboard that mostly just sits there. There'll be people that'll buy pots and pans, and they'll just hang them on the wall, and you realize this person really doesn't cook. But they certainly, have the look of it. But like your son, I'm practical that way. Also, I wouldn't consider myself a collector, so to speak, because to me I'm kind of a minimalist. I like space, but I also like nice things as far as that goes. So, it really stands out. Like, for instance, just recently, I think this was about 2 years ago, my wife and I decided to get a new bed, but we wanted to get away from the box spring nonsense that's being sold out there and go, for a nice single mattress, and then we wanted to get a really nice bed frame. So we were looking around in research, and I came across and I showed her the Chinese opium-style bed frame. Okay?
Uh-huh.
Are you familiar with those?
Century, yes, of course.
Yeah, and to me, that just glowed. I said, that's what I want, because it looked like nothing else that you've seen out there. And, as listeners look up, Chinese opium-style bed, and you'll see what I mean. And here's what was really fascinating about this process. So there was a place that used to make wood furniture that disappeared. I think it was called America the Beautiful Dreamer, which had that, but they were gone, so you couldn't get that anymore. So we began looking around, and, of course, you Google image things, and that's one great way to search. And I found that there were certain companies that were selling these, but they seemed to be outside the United States. So these frames were running for as much as $2,000 for a king-size frame is what we were looking for, because we wanted to also increase the size of the bed. Then all of a sudden I clicked and found that there was a place not too far from where we lived that specialized in teak wood furniture, and will actually make it as well. And what we found was we could get a king-size bed frame, the style that we wanted there, the opium style, for $800, or actually almost $900. And I thought, well, great, now we're saving the money. But here's what makes it even more intriguing. I guess most of those wood frames, and maybe even teak wood furniture, are made from actual trees that are grown specifically for that purpose. What he was selling us was wood that was actually called repurposed wood. In other words, this could have been an old Japanese dojo for all we know. Now, I found that intriguing, and I thought I just kind of wanted to have you share your thoughts on something like that real quickly.
Sure. So first of all, the history of the opium bed is fascinating because actually there's 2 names for those beds, and let me sort of paint a picture for the listeners. What that is, in the old way of speaking about it, I don't know if this is your design, but you'll tell me, Daniel. But in the old way of speaking about it, it's a 3-sided bed. In other words, the frame is 3 sides, whereas right now we've got a headboard and footboard. The opium bed has 3 sides. So, and sometimes it even has a little roof. So it's like a little room with the front wall taken out, and the mattress is sort of the centerpiece around the three corners of the room. And that was the old-style opium bed, and it was meant to have that front covered. In other words, there could have been drawn curtains at one point. And the reason for that is, for number one, like I said, there's two names for that bed. Number one, it could be called a marriage bed. So that was the bed that you used on your marriage, your wedding night. So it was a little room unto itself with a little sort of curtain that closed. And then when the privacy issue became really notable, what happened in San Francisco in the very end of the 19th century was the rise of opium dens. And so the bed became transmuted from marriage bed to opium bed because the actual was a perfect place to sit and partake in your opium den. You could lay down and smoke your opium pipe. And there was a whole tradition that gathered in many major cities around the opium beds and became actually when the temperance movement started to raise its head, that those beds became burnt publicly.
Wow.
Because they were such a symbol of the debauchery of the time of the opium dens. So they're very interesting. They go back a long way. There's a lot of iconography and history around those beds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as I was saying, as we were looking at bed frames, they all more or less seem to look the same. And in this particular frame, the way it is, you could actually put it into the middle of a room, and there's really no headboard at all.
That's right.
So you could sleep one side or the other. It's either you push it up against the wall, and that becomes the headboard, or you can move it away, and you can sleep any way you want it, especially a king-size bed. You can pretty much lay any way you want to on it. So
you, in fact, do have the three-sided, and it's made out of repurposed teak, you say.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And in fact, to give you some clue, and this will actually be interesting because you talk about this in your book, when one of the I think it was pieces of advice you learned early in your career of doing this is that one thing you follow is old things look old. And what I liked about what you talk about in that piece was the fact that you'll know something's old by the energy that you feel. Take something and hold it in your hand, and there'll be an experience you have. Now, with this opium bed, for the first many months, my wife was saying, I'm having a lot of these strange dreams, especially about Asia.
Is that right?
Yeah, and I found that interesting because I'm a dreamer myself, lucidly, since like the age of 5. But and this wasn't something I was experiencing. She goes, it's just really strange and kind of makes me feel a little uneasy. So I said, well, why don't we get some sage or fir or whatever it is and see if we can clear the energy. But she'd never expressed that before. And I don't know if it was because we had learned, as he told us right off the bat, he says, we use a lot of our stuff, it's repurposed wood, so it was something else before. And so when she shared her experience about what she was having as she was laying in this thing, I thought, wow, this is really intriguing. So let's talk a little bit more about that.
So what I can tell you is that she might have been picking up on two streams of energy. Number one is what I referred to a couple of minutes ago to the iconography. So the form itself of the opium bed goes back to the 1400s when it was called the marriage bed, and it was for the royal household, for the royal wedding, and the craftsman would spend a year as the wedding was being prepared working on such a bed. And so that bed has been in human consciousness now for a good 800 years. And so we've known of beds like that some of people, for example, Marco Polo, who would have gone into the courts in China back in the 1500s, would have said, gee, this is amazing. They're little kind of three-sided rooms unto themselves. And yes, they are freestanding. They don't need a wall to lean against. But they're little architectural spaces. And so there's the iconography of such a bed. In other words, it's been in the culture for a long time, irregardless of whose culture. And then the second part is repurposed wood. So the idea that that wood might hold some of the history of what it's been used for before, absolutely, I believe that that objects speak. And I think in the case of what your wife might have been picking up on as regards to the dreams coming through, could have been both. It could have been both the form of that bed. Who knows? She might have actually I've been in a previous life in a court in China. and too, the wood itself might be speaking to her, which often happens. I have a problem with dolls. I don't like dolls.
Yeah, I noticed when you were writing about that, especially that image you have in your book, I'm like, yeah, I could see where that doll would be kind of creepy to almost anybody.
Yes, I don't like dolls. Dolls frighten me, and I don't know where that comes from. I didn't like them as a little girl, and didn't like any kind of the Barbies going on or anything. I just don't like dolls. And for me, I can really pick up on the owners of dolls. In other words, I can hold a doll. I guess I'm keyed into being adverse anyway, but then I pick up a doll and I get a flash of, this was the owner or owners of this particular doll. So yeah, there's definitely, and it's funny because Daniel, the longer that you're in the world of material culture, the longer you're in the world of material objects, the finer your sense is when you touch something. The more keyed, and of course, there are people who are just naturally good with keying into anything historic. But the finer your sense gets to where you almost have to let that sense be its own guide and arbiter. So that sense tells quite a bit about the objects, although it's interesting being a career appraiser for 30 years. What I have to do is say, I sense this about this object, but at the same time, I've got to prove what my intuition is telling me. And so that's when I start the research.
Now, speaking of sense, you also talk about, and I really got a kick out of this story, but you say go with your gut instinct. And you shared a story about, I think it was your brother's wedding, which you said was a black tie affair. Now, tell us what happened there.
Yes. So actually people, it's sort of, I call it the psychiatric effect. When people find out that you appraise for a living, and I've appraised for 30 years, and I've seen so many households and so much material, and I kind of seen, I like to tell people I've pretty much seen it all, but then every day brings something else that our hands as humans have created. But people always grab you and say, you've got to come up and take a look at this painting. And so, you kind of get whisked away, and all of a sudden you're, like I said, the psychiatry moment, like, I have a brother who's having an affair, and, all of a sudden you realize it's you actually that are having the affair, and you're asking the psychiatrist off duty what the opinion is. So I often get whisked away to look at things in people's homes, without being actually employed.
There you go.
What do you think this painting is, and who did it, and what's, the style and this sort of thing. So, and I think that speaks to the ubiquity of objects in our world. We have made as human beings so many different and varied objects, but there's always something out there that talks to us or speaks to us. It's interesting, Penny, when we started this conversation, you said, I'm a minimalist. I like space, and I don't really collect, but I like fine things. How I read that is actually you are a collector. You are a collector of openness and spaciousness. So I don't necessarily think of the world of material as just antiques and art and those objects that we can buy and technology and this sort of thing. I think of it as regards what we treasure in regards to the outward elements of our life. So if you and your wife treasure space and openness, you're a collector of that. And that influences your personal aesthetic. Everybody has their own, their own idea of what their art form is and what they want in their environment. But that goes back to the caves at Lascaux, for example, where, you have your environment that you want to have the human hand touch in some way. So this is why I think it's so fascinating to go into, as I get to do, I go into many, many people's homes and see the kind of objects that I can actually use as little barometers to their own personalities and their own personal aesthetic. We had a client, I don't know if you're familiar with the late comedian Jonathan Winters.
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So we were appraisers for his large estate, and to go into his home was a window into his character. And what I can tell you is that I didn't know much about Jonathan. I didn't know much about his past. I was not quite old enough to really see him on TV too much. And I knew he was a great friend of Robin Williams, is how I kind of knew of him. And so we went into his home, and what do you think? He collected children's toys, especially boys' toys. So he collected cast iron airplanes and cars and anything cast iron, little tiny rolly cars and trucks and dump trucks and police cars, airplanes. And he, in fact, left an airplane to the great Robin Williams that we actually appraised before we delivered it. But what was interesting is later I found out, I was speaking with his son and daughter who are probably close to our age, and I was speaking to his son and daughter, and they said, Dad really didn't have the greatest childhood. His stepfather was not all that good to him, apparently, or there was some issue with a step-parent in his life, and he felt that he didn't have much of a childhood. So it's very interesting to walk to this magnificent, huge mansion and see, bookcases full of children's toys, as if this is something that through these objects I can grasp again.
Right.
That this happens a time and time again where the object, should I walk into your house, I would say, well, these are people that are very open. They like a lot of space. They're probably very open to various interesting and maybe quite outre ideas in life. In other words, that openness is a metaphor. And so your environment, what you collect space and openness, that becomes a metaphor about you. I find it interesting the differences in generations on that score as well, because, if you talk about the traditionalist generation and the boomer generation, the Gen X generation, and then the millennial generation, each of those generations has their own idea of space and what to fill it with or what not to fill it with. And it's a challenge right now for those of us who are boomers to try to give our items to our Gen Xers or our millennial children, because we didn't realize it, but the idea of what works in a space has changed for those generations. I mean, really very much changed. Now, many of my clients despair of, what am I going to do with these things? My kids don't want them. My kids do not want these objects that I have spent $300 a month to store in the storage locker. These kids don't want these objects. So I often get called in when parents think, well, what am I going to do with these things? I thought my kids would love them. I've saved them for years, but my kids they're not only are they not thrilled to have them, but they don't know what to do with these objects. And I referenced at the beginning of our conversation very fine china services for entertaining for a formal dinner party. They don't really want that. And therefore, the market for formal china is terribly down, because if no one buys the stuff, there is no market. You see, it goes away, it declines. So right now, there's more formal china sets out there at auction than you can shake a stick at, because nobody's kids really wants that stuff with the gold or platinum trim. They don't want to put it in, well, they can't put it in the microwave, and they can't put it in the dishwasher. They certainly don't want to, go into tears if some little piece is broken. So, the market has really interesting fluctuations. If you go back 100 years, those China services were incredibly expensive and very desired, and you couldn't be married in an upper middle class home without being given a set of china. And many people, when they were married, put that on their registry. I want to have a beautiful collection of china. That market is gone.
Mm.
Absolutely gone.
Yeah, certainly the only time you see that market is when you're watching a movie about a couple who's getting married. And I'm thinking, registries, who even does that anymore?
Well, exactly. And that couple who were getting married, they're not getting married in 2017 and having formal dinner parties for the most part. It's the most top-notch wanted object. Those sets of formal china, as far as my clients tell me, and that it runs a close second to objects, for example, like those bigger, heavier, darker pieces of furniture from the 19th century. Nobody wants that big, heavy sideboard. As beautiful as it may be, as carved as it may be, nobody wants that in that generation, let's say 40 to 20 years of age. Nobody wants that.
And Elizabeth, you're bringing up something that I think really can create what I would call an interesting divide of people. And that is, for instance, me, if I'm going to buy, let's say, art, I want to buy it because I want to put it up on the wall or set it on a countertop because it inspires me. I just love looking at it. And as Anthony Robbins would say, it's something that can put you into a state, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are those people who want to go out and they want to buy art for the sake of saying, I have this. It really doesn't matter, but I paid $3, $4, $5 million for this. Take a look at this. And you can almost feel like what matters is what they paid for it in status. And then there are those people who actually, collect. And these are my own divisions. Certainly you can change those if you want to. And there was
summarize for me your divisions. I counted 3. So
okay,
summarize.
well these were just ones that came. I don't know how many I actually have. These were just 3 that came to mind for me personally. And then there are those that actually collect things because it's interesting to have a collection. And to give you a case in point, I thought this was a really intriguing one. It was someone I worked with probably about 20 plus years ago. And back in the late part of the 1980s, 1990s, people who are familiar with basketball and, of course, the Olympic sports, that's when we created the first American Dream Team basketball team, considered to be the greatest assembly of athletes on a single team ever in the history of sports. So what had happened was 7-Eleven started featuring the Dream Team Slurpee Cup. And I thought, that's kind of cool, and I remember seeing them, but I didn't think much about it. So one night I'm over at my friend's apartment, and he says, yeah, that's my Dream Team collection up there. What he had was every single cup of every single member that was on that team, and he had 2 sets of them. And when you see this collection, you're like, wow, that is so cool. From a 7-Eleven of all things. When you finally seen each of these team members, and he had 2 of each of these cups, Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, then it just came alive and screamed value at you. And these were just Slurpee cups. Then another thing he did, too, and this was around that same, for me it did, and around that same time, there was also an intriguing phenomenon in the NBA, and that is East Coast team players seemed to be smaller in stature than the West Coast teams did. And this was back in like 1989, 1990, right around that time there. So there was I think it was like a Winco Foods, and anybody who's been into a food place like this, within a lobby area, there's those little claw machines where you can win stuffed animals. And apparently what was happening was they were having these NBA bears that you could go and you can win in these claw machines. And this is what this guy actually spent time doing. He spent time collecting every East Coast NBA bear and every West Coast NBA bear in these little claw machines. And he puts them side by side, and when you notice, the West Coast team bears were actually just slightly bigger than the East Coast team bears. And I'm like, wow. But when you see these collections together, you're just fascinated by this. And so to me, that would be kind of the 3 categories. A, you're inspired. That's why you buy something, because it inspires you, or you collect or whatever. B, it's just for baby status. Look what I've got, kind of a showing off thing. Or C, you're just a true collector, and there's particular collections you just like to go after. But certainly, let us kind of know in your experience how that all lays out and what you've experienced.
Okay, I kind of know a little bit about this topic, Daniel, because
well, you should after 30 years.
Yeah, I should. I know a little bit, but I know a little bit about it on a scholarly level, because when I took my doctorate in art history, my doctoral thesis was entitled Material Image, Why Collectors Collect. And that was the title of my dissertation for my PhD. And I studied the different levels of collecting. And I will give you the levels. I was interested that you stated 3. I'll give you the levels that I came up with after, writing for 3-4 years on my dissertation. I came up with that there are people who acquire, and so the people who acquire, I'll give you a concrete example of a person who acquires. Let's say there's Aunt Mildred. And Aunt Mildred, every place she goes with Uncle Jim, she picks up a little porcelain frog. And so if she's gone to Niagara Falls or Bermuda or, wherever she goes, she picks up as a souvenir a little porcelain frog. So she acquires the frogs without really an idea of quality or rarity. They mean something to her on a sentimental level, but they don't mean anything to her as far as her furtherance of her knowledge of the world, of her education level of art. She's not that concerned with how porcelain is made. She may not even know they're porcelain or ceramic or the difference. She just picks them up because she acquires these little, everybody knows a lady like this, don't we? That
right.
Acquires these little ceramic, whatever they are, in this case, Aunt Mildred's frogs. So she's an acquirer.
And they put a story behind where they got that and when they were and what that experience was like.
It has nothing to do with, for example, it's a person that it's the same level as I'll give you an example. Have you ever gone into someone's home, and it's quite a gorgeous home, and they have a library, for example. They have a separate room they call the library. And if they've had a decorator or an interior designer, that interior designer or decorator would have said, oh, these books would look fabulous here. And they're not read. Those books are not read, or they're not actually even taken down for any kind of reference. But those books look well there, and they mean something about that person's room. So that's an acquirer. That's someone who acquires objects. The next level is someone who collects. Someone who collects objects, they have a general specific idea of the parameters of their collection. So let's say, I'll give you an example of a person like that. That would be a person who says, I will collect every baseball from every World Series that is signed by more than 3 players that I can afford.
Right.
And you see, they narrow from the acquiring standpoint, the collector narrows the collection down to more specific things that require more specific learning about the object. So that collector now knows the history of baseball, the history of winning teams, the history of players, the history of when those games were played and where. You see, so I
could even tell you what the stats of those 3 players were during that World Series, yeah.
Yes. So it's the person who, instead of just looking at the books in the library because they've got nice leather bindings, is actually taking them down and researching 5 elements of what's in those books. And they grow as a person in the world. They know more than an acquirer. The next level is a connoisseur. So we have acquirers, collectors, and connoisseurs. A connoisseur is someone who, they're collectors, but they're collectors who do one more thing than just say, I will collect every baseball by winning teams in the World Series with more than 3 autographs, etc. They go one step further, and they say, I will collect, not only will I collect those things, but I'll collect only the best I can afford, only the top end of what I can afford, the rarest pieces I can afford. But what they do is, how I know my clients become connoisseurs, how I know that, Daniel, is when they call me and say, I need to get rid of the bottom 1/3 of my collection. When they start weeding them out because they're not quite as good as what they aspire to, now they're connoisseurs. Because what they're doing is they're becoming more and more educated to what makes the difference between the top, the middle, and the bottom of a certain type of object. So they're saying, not only do I understand about these baseballs being from the World Series, signed by more than 3 players, and in the winning teams that I can afford, that's the top of the heap of what's out there. What they're saying is, not only do I want those things, but what I do not want is anything less than that. And so what happens with connoisseurs is connoisseurs take the bottom third of their collection and sell that bottom third so that they can build up on top of the very top of the collection. So it's a refined and smaller collection usually, but it's usually so much better and so much more valuable because they're refining up instead of broadening out.
So even though it's a 7-Eleven Slurpee cup, this had a lot of value because there was no other team like that. And the fact that he had 2 sets, and, you're thinking they're just Slurpee cups, but like I said, when you see the set, you're thinking, wow.
Well, it's interesting that you're mentioning something what we call a common culture collectible. So such things as Beanie Babies, Slurpee cups, Happy Meals figures, Cabbage Patch dolls, Troll dolls, Barbie dolls, et cetera, naughty heading dolls from the World Series, this sort of thing. It's very interesting that you're talking about that arena of collecting because, ironically, those can be worth a lot. And why? Because let's say I'm a person that's dragging my kid into McDonald's for a Happy Meal, and I get a little figure. My son gets a little figure in his what was a little box that used to come in. 5 out of 10 people are going to throw that away. And then as the years go by, out of those 5 people that might have retained that little figure, 3 of them are going to throw those away, or they'll get broken, or nobody will remember where they are.
They'll end up in a thrift store in a bag full of other things, for $1.
So what happens is, if it's common and there's a lot of them at the beginning, what happens at the end, because people say to themselves, oh, it's common and there's a lot of it out there, throw it away. So what happens 50 years later is it's not common and there's not a lot out there because everybody was under the perception that they are out there and they will get thrown away, and they are throwing those away. So I'll give you an example. It's called depression glass. And so in the Great Depression, we're talking here in the 30s in the United States, in the Great Depression, if you went to a fair and you threw the ball through the figure and you made a hole in one or whatever a game was at the fair, you were given a piece of glass. And the glass was usually pastel color, sometimes pink, sometimes green, sometimes light blue, for example, had a tint to it in the glass. And the glass was pressed glass, like we talked about at the beginning of the hour. So it was pressed glass, and it had a little lacy pattern on it. And it was given out as awards for fairs. So these things were cheap, and they were plentiful. Well, in the 1960s and 70s, so many people broke them, threw them out, thought this is just a little trinket that was given to me at the fair. Who cares about it? It became expensive and desirable, and people would pay $30, $40, $50, $60, $70, and upwards for a little saucer or a little piece of glass because people never thought to hold on to them. They were just trinkets. So the Slurpee collection that your friend has, you see, because they were plentiful and because he curated them, because he formed a duplicate collection, eventually that's going to be more valuable than something that one perceives of as rare.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that's the weird thing about the way the market works in my world is because you can have something very plentiful today. I'm thinking, for example, of the phenomena of the resurgence in the millennial generation of their desire to collect vinyl records. They want vinyl records, and they'll search everywhere for vinyl records that, we could find in a garage sale 10, 15 years ago. People's big stacks of vinyl records, because nobody wanted those. Everybody was moving towards digital. So we threw them out. We got rid of them. We garage saled them. We estate saled them. Now this generation is paying, this millennial generation is paying quite a bit for those old records.
I want to touch on a story that I think is pretty intriguing when you talk about vinyl records, and this really goes in hand with what you're really bringing up when it comes to collecting value and divesting, and that is, the idea of value itself. Now, most people think, I shouldn't say most people, there might be people out there that think, I want to invest in art for the idea that it's going to go up in value, so it's an investment, sort of like a company. But I know certainly you talk quite a bit about that in your book. But first of all, the idea of value, and back to what I was going to talk about, which is vinyl records. Here's a really a great story, and it's one of those where you knew at that moment I should have done something or moved on this, and then you hit yourself in the head realizing that window is passed. Back in the 1970s, Peter Frampton came out with an album called Frampton Comes Alive, which
sure.
Yeah, and I know you probably are very familiar with that. That was the best-selling live rock album of all time. Now, he made the mistake, and Robert Stigwood produced a movie, and I know you remember this, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, of which Peter Frampton became a star in. And the rock fans overnight dumped him. They said, we're done. You sold out to the Bee Gees and disco. You're no longer a rocker. And they were burning his albums. Frampton Comes Alive became irrelevant. So you brought up the thrift store, the Frampton Comes Alive album, and I remember some of them being in pretty darn good condition. We're talking even the covers as well as the album itself, for as little as 25 cents an album. Okay?
Uh-huh.
This is what sucks, and I use this word because you're hearing regret here. Then Peter Frampton had a resurgence. In other words, the rock genre decided we're going to claim him back. He had a resurgence, came out with a new album, and this was in right around the mid to late 1990s. You couldn't find a Frampton Comes Alive album, a used one, for less than $25. And here I have these darn things at my fingertips. I just knew this guy was just too good of a musician. Yeah, you're going to abandon him now, but I know this guy's going to come back here for a quarter, and the albums were so available at these thrift stores or Goodwills for 25, 50 cents, $1 in great condition. You just can't have the foresight sometimes. So, and you talk about the value that some people actually look to. Geez, I wonder what the inherent value will be of something in the future, so to speak.
So there's what you're talking about it falls in the category of fadness, being a fad. And being a fad is interesting because there's people that, like the stock market, and what I do as an appraiser is sometimes I'll get called upon to project the value. So how that works is, let's say an elderly couple is preparing their trust, and they want to know, they've got, say, 4 paintings and 4 children, and they want to know that, in 15 years, those paintings will be worth about the same because they want to give them on an equal basis. So we call that an appraisal for equitable distribution, and we project the value forward. And it takes a little bit of finessing because you have to know the market as it stands and what the trajectory has been over the last, say, 5, 10 years. And so you look at that and you say, okay, what's the market? But what you probably should have done with the Frampton records is to say, not necessarily that this is Peter Frampton and he's an individual case unto himself. What I would have done had I been you is said, let's look at a musician who did make a record. In other words, we're going to find similar comparable situations. There's someone who made a record who was disabused in the public eye, and then came full steam ahead by the next generation. And I can think of, for example, Frank Sinatra had the same kind of thing where he actually was beloved by my mom's generation, and then he was kind of old school when people didn't go to see him or buy his records, and then people rediscovered him in his older years, and all of a sudden he was rediscovered. He was somebody whose records, his old records, were worth a lot. And so you look at that and you say, who is somebody that the music world, for example, said he's gone, he's passed, he's old hat, we're not interested, and then researched. And then you say, well, how much did he research for? And is that a trend in the music world in general? When the next generation gets a hold of that artist, does that next generation then maybe blur the lines between what you were saying, rocker and pop? And in fact, they did. So it's a little bit of speculation, but how we as appraisers look at that is we don't tend to look at it as an individual object or artist. We tend to look at it as how did that situation happen before?
Right.
I'll give you an example. I had an appraisal for a gentleman where he was a dot-commer, and he had developed in the late 80s, early 90s, he developed a certain software, and he sold it for, I can't tell you how much, but tons of millions of dollars. He sold this particular software when he was probably 55 or so. And so he had built this kind of software. He'd marketed it. He'd actually done very well with it, and then he sold it for a lot of money. And all of his collections and books and theories and charts and software development tables and all of his research for a large office was all virtual. In other words, there was no physical objects. They were all in various computers. So his whole collection was all digital, all in computers, all 010101. And he came to me and said, I want to give my collection to a library. I want to donate my collection. And there were 20,000 digital objects, we can call them. They weren't real. But they were real in digital terms. And I want to give those to a very, very famous museum of digital technology. And I'd like to take the fair market value against my taxes. Because if you donate something, you see, you get a tax credit.
Right.
And so he was asking me to set a value for the government to take against his taxes. And whenever you deal with the IRS regards taxes, it's always a little bit touch and go as an appraiser because you better get it right. Your client's tax burden is on the line. So we did the research, and there really hadn't been any up to that point a couple of years back. There hadn't been any such collection donated, and so there was no comparable sales of digital collections being donated, and so there was nothing I can go to the IRS and say, you see, let's give you an example, Daniel. This house is worth X because the house next to it and the house next to that sold for X. Those are comparable sales. There was no such thing for this digital collection. It had no digital collection had been sold.
It's almost like you're creating a new market altogether.
Well, you have to create new markets based on similar markets.
Okay.
And so what we did was, instead of, this is kind of an interesting, I found it an interesting thing. What we did was say, was there a point in media history that the boilerplate for a presentation, because this is software that was meant to produce something visual. Was there ever in digital media history a time when a boilerplate, which was really nothing, just maybe words on paper, was the boilerplate for a huge industry going forward and a huge business that grew out of that industry? So we went back in time and we thought, okay, what industry, what particular company could, when that company sold their objects, which were perceived when they were starting out as nothing, how would this be similar? Well, what we did was we researched and found that the scripts the actual scripts that were used on TV for the franchise, which became I Love Lucy, from the Desilu Studios, were similar insofar that they were just words on a typed piece of paper, but as an aggregate, they represented all of the riches and the income and the funds from Desilu. So you see what I'm saying? It's nothing, because the production was just on TV. It was a digital image. Not a digital, it was an analog image. But we had nothing to go off of regards comparables if we kept it in the same historical time. But if you go back and you say, okay, how is this like something that's happened in the past, which did sell recently, you can get a sense of where that market is going. It's working on the assumption that any one item has about 8 similar characteristics to its brothers. And the characteristics, if let's take, for example, a work of art, there's the fact it's two-dimensional in a painting, per se. Let's say it has a certain color scheme, has a certain size, has a certain genre, has a certain period in history, has a certain artist who's affiliated with a certain group, has a certain method of being framed, for example. So all of those 8 characteristics, those all transmute into other pieces, other paintings. So you can actually say, okay, let's change one of those characteristics and then look at the market for that. So it's a little bit of speculation. People say, well, isn't it just your own particular feeling on it? Yes, it takes experience and it takes a sort of a feeling about it, but there's actual some science to it as well, insofar as if you've got 8 characteristics and you change one, the depending on what the value is, the percentage of value is only going to change, 1/8%. So, I mean, there's a little bit of science behind it, too.
And you certainly outline that, too, where you talk about how it was suggested for you to become good as focus on a single area, and in the case for you it was on marbles. But you began realizing when you really looked into the nature of the thing, and I think you'd spent a couple of years doing this, that you got to a point where you would be, as Malcolm Gladwell will call it, a flash, where you just know now when you see something, maybe a marble, boom, I have a really good idea what that's like in a flash because you've been so absorbed into that. And again, as I've been talking about, as we've been sharing for our listeners out there, the idea of value. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the program, I was talking about the Antiques Roadshow and how people, they'll bring something in that was probably sitting in an attic or a basement, or maybe they found it at a thrift store, and then they just become amazed when the guy says, by the way, this is worth $30,000 and you paid $5 for it, or it's been sitting in Grandpa's closet for 20 years. But you also share the fact that what they're appraising is more of the insurance value rather than maybe the actual value. And as our listeners have been hearing you today, Elizabeth, certainly value really fluctuates. It depends on who wants it. There's just a lot of interesting little variables versus what maybe the insurance, the insurability of something is. There's a much different thing in regards to that.
Yes, so let me address your first point first, which is my tutorship, my mentorship by a senior appraiser who knew that I liked fine art and fine antiques. And so just to make me focus on the learning part, he said, right, your exam for your appraisal certificate, I'm going to give you a very extensive test on children's toys, specifically marbles. And my lips curled because I thought, I have no interest in marbles. But that was the point, because when you study one thing, it doesn't matter what you study. It could be those sippy cups that you were talking about, or it could be Beanie Babies, or it could be fine Picassos. It could be anything. When you start to really hone down and study one particular type of object, what you learn is the time it was made, who made it, who consumed it, the chemical manufacture of the material itself, how it was produced, who produced it, What was the factory like? Was it an individual artist? Who was the patent holder? What's the history of playing with round things? You see, when was it at its apex as far as a pastime for children, which happened to be right at the turn of the last century? So that opens your eyes to what? It opens your eyes to how children were socialized, how they were meant to be perceived as learning, and what did they learn when they played with these marbles? How did it influence them? You see, it opens up a whole world that, it's not just, oh, yes, I can recognize a tiger eye when I see one. It opens up a world of that object in time, in history, and what it was used for. So you become an expert in everything around that object. So that's why I refer to the field in which I'm in as material culture, because material culture means it's material. It has material properties. It has depth, weight, height, etc. Has material properties, but it actually comes from a culture and speaks to a culture. Mm-hmm. And it's indicative of that culture. I would like to tell my students, if you take a look at a toaster that makes your toast in the morning, you can tell more about American culture than you can. It tells you the whole. It talks about the culture of ease, the culture of expanding the market, so that instead of having a stick over a fire to cook bread, we now have a full-on machine. It talks about how our kitchens are laid out. It talks about the tradition of breakfast. It talks about the tradition of bread. It talks about why sliced bread came to be, the standardization of material versus the market for sliced bread. I mean, there's all these things, and it opens your eyes to it's not just one object. That object can tell story upon story upon story if you go deep enough into the object.
I was going to point out, too, we got about 2 minutes left here on the program, and certainly, Elizabeth, this is one of those things you could talk about for hours because there's so much that you cover in such a wonderful way in the book that you just keep turning the pages in this thing, and I just had a lot of fun, and I'm going to be enjoying more of reading this. But you brought up the Beanie Baby, and here's something that I found quite fascinating, is I actually heard this guest who came on to a radio program some time ago talk about the Beanie Baby. He says, it's funny that these Beanie Babies came to be as valuable as they were. There was the lion that was worth $5,000, $10,000, whatever the case was. He says, but what people really should understand is the Beanie Baby, the creator of the Beanie Babies, was actually, in a way, a genius, if you will, on impulsiveness, especially in the American culture. He would actually do very limited runs. And that's what made them seem to be more valuable than they really were. Now, Beanie Babies, I don't know whether they have any value like they did, but people were going nuts over these things, and this is what this guy understood. So, yeah, the tiger's valuable because he actually only did maybe 1,000 tigers. So he was playing on the fact that people would become greedy that way. And I remember reading in a newspaper one time about this guy who had somehow acquired, I can't remember how, a bunch of Beanie Babies who was just willing to just sell them to anybody who wanted the whole collection for like $5 just to get rid of them. And he says he could have never expected the onslaught of people coming after him. Did you know this one's worth this? And he was like, I don't really care. I just want to get rid of them.
Yep. And I have to mention to you that they're not worth much at all today. And
well, because of the internet, you find out they weren't as, rare as people thought they were.
That's right. Right. Well, see, that just shows you that if you study something, you realize something that's part of the philosophy behind how and why it was made. And so the structure of limiting the market, understanding greed, understanding limited editions, understanding a manipulated marketplace, all that was part of the object itself. And I also wanted to mention, I'm finishing up a second book now, and that'll be out in a couple of months. And that book is called No Thanks, Mom, The 10 Top Items Your Kids Do Not Want. And and what to do with them. And so that's the title of my next book coming out, Daniel.
Well, Elizabeth, we would love to have you back on the show. Again, there's even more I'd like to talk to about this, especially my own experience with sign books. But that's a whole other story because of what I experienced. And I'd like to bring you back on the show again. So when that book comes out, let's connect and let's make this happen. But before we go, Elizabeth, could you give out a website people can find out more about you, your work, and even how to collect, value, and divest?
Yes, certainly. So my website is ElizabethAppraisals.com. So it's Elizabeth with a Z. Appraisals is plural. So it's ElizabethAppraisals.com. And on there you can find some of the links to buy the book, and you can also find some of the radio. I do a radio program here in Santa Barbara, which we talk about art antiques. I also do a column weekly. People write me with a picture of something, and I analyze what that is. And that's all on my website, too. And there's also an archive of that if people say, oh, gee, I wonder if that Chinese platter was worth anything. You'll find it on the website, ElizabethAppraisals.com.
Very good. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us here on the program today. Very valuable and entertaining insight as well.
Thank you for having me.
You bet. Well, thank you to listeners out there for joining us. Again, the book is Collect, Value, and Divest. I know you'll find this a great read, and it'll certainly open your eyes to what value really means to you. You can also visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter so you can stay up to date on what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming programs. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.